Welcome back from break. And now we're ready for our session on cybersecurity. And as you heard in the emerging risks, starting us off today, cybersecurity was front and center for a main regulator in the United States, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And so this is a very timely and important topic. And I'd like to introduce Dale to introduce the remainder of our panel.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So this session, we're going to delve into the growing challenge that companies and governments face as the impact, severity, prevalence of cybersecurity and ransomware attacks has increased in recent years across the globe. We'll take a deeper dive into a couple particular examples as it relates to attacks that we've all seen in the news, and we'll talk about who's conducting these attacks, where they're going with them, what we should be doing as companies and governments to protect against these, and hopefully we'll take some lessons learned that all of us can take back to our own companies. So I'd like to quickly introduce our two terrific panelists that we have with very in-depth knowledge of this topic, have been experts in this field for many years. And fortunately have much more experience in this field than I do. Sushila Nair is Vice President for Security Services at NTT Data's Chief Digital Office. She's been an author, a thought leader in this topic. She's served as a Chief Information Security Officer for over 10 years, has 25 plus years of experience in computing infrastructure, security, cybersecurity, and has served as a legal expert witness. So want to introduce you and thanks Sushila for joining us.
Thanks, Dale. Looking forward to the conversation.
And then second, we have Malcolm Harkins. Malcolm is Chief Security and Trust Officer for Epiphany Systems. He's responsible for enabling client growth with optimal information security systems. Has been focused on helping smaller startups, venture capital, etc. He's testified on cybersecurity before the U.S. Senate. He's previously served as Chief Security Officer at Cylance, Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. And so we welcome Malcolm and his broad experience in this particular topic.
Thanks, Dale.
So as we look to the news, right, we've all seen probably the headlines around the huge JBS meatpacking debacle with their systems getting taken over. Colonial Pipeline was in the news. CNA Insurance had a fairly significant takeover that forced them to pay a significant ransom. We've all remember the WannaCry attack, the SolarWinds attack. These things seem to be increasing in terms of prevalence, in terms of societal impacts. Is there one or two of these that stand out to you as particularly interesting in terms of how they got in, who conducted the attack, and what some additional controls are that we're kind of lacking as you think about what happened in one or two of these particular examples?
Great. Shall I dive in then, Dale? Would you like me to mention a couple that really kind of stands out for me?
Yeah, please.
Great. So certainly, I think for me, one of the ones, it's a 2017 attack of NotPetya. And just a little background here. What happened was a group called the Shadow Brokers, and there are many theories about how they managed to obtain some exploits that the NSA had developed. But they did manage to obtain these exploits. And we can think of exploits as being like cyber weapons, right? And what they did is they actually sold it. And they sold it to who we believe the North Koreans. And the North Koreans put together what looked like ransomware, but might be considered wiperware because they actually hard-coded the wallets into it. So very shortly, when the wallets were disabled, people could really pay for it. WannaCry came out first, hit the evening news, 150 countries in 24 hours. It moved fast. If it wasn't for a security researcher called Marcus Hutchinson, who found the kill switch, it'd probably be still traveling right now. So a phenomenal story there. And to follow up with that, NotPetya was what the Russians then developed themselves into their own malware, which was called NotPetya. And NotPetya was actually infiltrated through a software update from a very, very popular tax software. And the result of this was when people were infected, it moved so quickly and so fast, people describe walking past computers and then just going dark one after the other and people going home. And it caused so much damage that it was called out at the end of year financial reports for FedEx, for Mondelez. And I feel this attack is particularly significant because in fact, it became a conversation around the fact that this was identified as being a nation state attack. And therefore the cyber insurance companies would not pay out because most insurance does not cover nation state attacks. I did want to kind of throw that in there. So certainly a lot of things there around those attacks, and also to just highlight the people that did not fall victim in the same extent to NotPetya, picked out two things that they said they did differently. They patched regularly and they segmented their network. So that 2017 attack I thought was very interesting. The other attack that I think is very significant is the Colonial Pipeline, because the Colonial Pipeline was done by DarkSide. DarkSide actually, interestingly enough, even has a site up saying we don't attack critical infrastructure. We're not evil. We've donated money. It's interesting. There's some marketing back there, right? They got into Colonial Pipeline. It was actually just a billing system, but Colonial Pipeline closed down. Obviously, this was a critical infrastructure attack in the US that really caused enormous amounts of problems. They made a decision to pay, but they worked with the FBI. And I highlight this attack because, again, it is believed with DarkSide that it actually checks. They're a ransomware as a service company, so they actually sell ransomware services. It was unusual that they did the attack, but they also, interestingly enough, their software will check if your keyboard is in Russian and make a decision not to attack you. So I want to highlight this because this is also, there's some politics behind cyber attacks that make them particularly difficult to deal with as well. So those are the two I wanted to share because I think that they are critical from a policy and discussion basis.
Yeah, Malcolm, can we talk a little bit more about Colonial Pipeline? Because I think you and I talked a little bit about this one. You followed some of the news articles around this. You listened to some of the congressional hearings about it. And are there some more interesting details that you would share and takeaways that you would have as it relates to Colonial?
Yeah, I would. And before I do that, though, I do want to up level a little bit. We've talked and you mentioned the escalating prevalence and stuff like that. And let's look at cause and effect. While threat actors and threat agents have more actively gone after companies directly, indirectly, and all that type of stuff, the cause and effect is the fact that we've honestly done a sloppy job in managing our internal security programs and efforts internally in our organizations. And we've also done a sloppy job at the creation of technology, leaving too many vulnerabilities in it. So when you really look at cause and effect, it is those of us who manage technology and those of us who created it who've actually, by and large, driven the problem set that we've seen today and created the perfect storm of risk. So when you look at accountability, we have to all take accountability ourselves first and foremost. The threat actor and threat agent, while interesting in understanding their motives, that's not something we can control. We can really only control how vulnerable and how exploitable our organizations are. So with that as a backdrop, let's unpack the Colonial Pipeline issue a bit. At least from public testimony I've seen, the things I've read, again, I'm not an insider, I don't have all the knowledge, but for me, it was quite irritating to hear the Colonial Pipeline executives state that an exposed identity and lack of multi-factor authentication was the cause for that ransomware. That was the cause from an initial compromise. An initial compromise does not have to lead to catastrophe. there was a whole daisy chain of internal movement that they did and lack of controls and things like that, that they didn't cognitively, at least from my perspective, and I might be wrong, really understood the connection between an identity device all the way through into what caused the problem. And as Sheila mentioned, their billing system. Well, their billing system was ransomed, which meant they weren't able to produce and move oil and gas. Now, the attackers, if you believe what they said, they didn't realize that that was going to occur. They were just trying to shut off a revenue stream in the hopes that they would be able to get a ransom. And so when you look at it, you go, did Colonial Pipeline cognitively understand the connections and the attack path from anything to something that matters? And I would submit they probably didn't. And I think that that is a true statement across most organizations, because identity devices, networks, applications, and all of the spider web of things that we have in our organizations, most IT organizations don't cognitively understand how something that is valuable could be cross-connected all the way out to something that's irrelevant. And without understanding that exploitable attack path, we're constantly going to miss things like this. And it could have been a mistake that actually, let's just look at Colonial Pipeline. A mistake could have had that happen. If the billing system went down because of a drive failure, an application hiccup, the same thing would have occurred. So in reality, you can't just blame the simple lack of multi-factor authentication or identity exposed as the cause. The real cause was a lack of control through that entire exploitable attack path that caused it to occur.
Now, maybe this is a question for either one of you, but do you think that's just a simple soundbite that's helpful to appeasing a bunch of angry or purported to be angry congressmen, or is there a deeper misunderstanding within the IT organizations that it's as simple as putting this kind of front end multi-factor authentication on top, and now we don't have the kind of exposure that we had before?
I think it's honestly a little bit of both. On the one hand, you're talking to a congressional hearing. They don't cognitively understand this, so giving them a soundbite makes sense. From a honing in on one little control also makes it easier to say, hey, we fixed that, when in reality, they still left an attack path open. So they might have gone and fixed that issue, but it doesn't mean that that exploitable path was eliminated. And then the other part is, frankly, the security industry perpetuates some of these simple notions, because if I was selling MFA or I was selling account takeover services or something like that, I would always blame the simple things so that I could peddle more product. So you have this confluence of, it's easier for an executive to explain that to Congress. It's easier for the IT and security organization to make one little change and say we've negated the issue. It's easier for the press to have a soundbite like that. And then the security industry, who profits from the insecurity of computing, can leverage that to then go push and amplify that that's the real cause and effect, versus there's a lot more complexity to it. And so in reality, I think we all succumb to those simple sound bites because of the motivations that we have and the indicators that we're driven to hit.
I guess one of my only, thoughts around this, and I was thinking about this, and you're absolutely right, there's more of a focus now on identity, but also I think that not using multi-factor authentication is kind of equivalent to driving a car without brakes. And it may not be the fact that you didn't have the brakes that killed you, right? But it's pretty sensible to have brakes in your car because at some point it's going to come get you. And almost every attack that you can think of has an identity component, right? So take, for instance, the 2001, JPMC attack, really interesting attack where what happened was they had the third party that actually set up, they run this annual corporate challenge site to raise charity. And what happened was many of the people that signed up for that third party site used JPMC accounts. They reused their corporate password, right? And what happened was the bad guys managed to take over that certificate and actually look at the encrypted traffic. So now they had people's usernames and passwords, and they found, this is the trick, isn't it? They found a couple of servers at JPMC that did not use multi-factor authentication, and they were straight in. So the reality goes, right, if you leave your driving license around or your credit card around, I wonder how long it would take before somebody actually did some serious damage to your bank account. So similarly, if you've got a technology network and you're not running multi-factor authentication, then you really are driving without your brakes. And whilst I do agree you need a program to understand what all your security risks are, because it may not be your brakes that get you, but out of the gates, guys, we got to get the multi-factor authentication right.
Well, I completely agree with you. And I think you're right. There's really two primary ways in which all these attacks are occurring: execution of malicious code or identity-based attacks. And even if it starts with an identity-based attack, malicious code gets placed. Why? So you can weaponize it and laterally move and all those things. So those are the two primary ways in which it's occurring. And I completely agree with you. I just think, again, if you go back 20 years, we used to talk about the hard, crunchy outside and the soft, gooey inside. Well, guess what? We're still doing that because we're just adding extra crunchiness with an endpoint control and extra crunchiness with an identity control, but we still have the soft, gooey inside that we moaned and groaned about for a couple of decades, and nobody's done anything about that because it's hard. But in reality, if you actually understand the motive of the attacker, you understand what is critical in your environment from a business process, what is critical from a system, what is critical from a data, and then from there you back out into the exploitable attack path, you'll actually be able to figure out where you got to go focus your identity and patching and malicious code execution, because you can see the nothing thing is in an exploitable path to the something that matters. And then you're going to understand that daisy chain of how to break the attack path, or where you need to put eyes on glass to watch for issues occurring so that you can mitigate it quickly before it detonates into something that's a disaster.
Yesterday, I was having a chat with Dale, and we were talking about, I thought it's so interesting that, we've solved problems like this before. So for instance, in food safety, right, 1906, I believe it was Upton Sinclair's book, and I wrote a blog about this actually, called The Jungle, which exposed some of the security and some of the safety issues surrounding food production. And the public was so horrified that Theodore Roosevelt at the time had to regulate, and we now have food inspections and we enforce standards because we realize that we can't always trust businesses to do the right thing. And I guess the question, Dale and I were discussing yesterday was around the fact, we now have CISA, right, which is really great, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is coming up and announcing best practices. The question becomes, right, will organizations do the right thing, and do they understand how to do the right thing without some form of regulation that says, this is what the right thing looks like, that uses the minimum bar to be able to store personal information. Because really, I think, we had to ask people that were listening in on this forum, how many of you have lost your identity in a breach? It's a pandemic of stolen identities, right? Yes. So this is something that we need to solve.
Yes. Yeah, a better question, Sushila, might be how many times, right, you've lost your.
Well, but again, let's again unpack your will people do the right things. A year ago yesterday, I actually led a webinar at the RSA conference, a webcast with a few chief security officers called Integrity Matters. And I did a survey of a lot of chief information security officers, chief security officers across the United States. 70+% of people in that role have said that they were asked or they actually watered down the risk portrait to the board. So you have a pressure coming from business leaders and executives to, in essence, mischaracterize the expert's view of risk. Number one. Number two, a couple of years ago, the National Association of Corporate Directors did a survey of corporate directors across the United States, and 61% of them said that they would compromise on cybersecurity for the sake of a business objective. So I would say the data suggests today that people won't do the right thing. And I would also suggest that even if you put standards in place, we have a lot of them. PCI standard, SOC 2, Sarbanes-Oxley. We've got all these things. And people are checking the box saying, yeah, I'm meeting all these compliance regimes, and yet risk is still occurring. Those compliance regimes, those standards are in many cases static, while risk is dynamic. And they're pointing you in some cases towards controls that are ineffective and inefficient. Why? Because one, they're static, and two, they're people who have an economic incentive to point you towards dated technology and dated approaches. Why? Because they're selling you stuff and they want it to stay in a compliance regime so they can protect their profit motives, rather than recognize risk is dynamic and we all have to be accountable to managing a dynamic set of controls because of the dynamic nature of threats and vulnerabilities.
And whilst I don't think compliance solves risk, I do actually think it's actually improved the risk posture endlessly. How many people remember when they used to print receipts with our credit card numbers on it, right? How many people know that in the TJ Maxx, right, they had no Wi-Fi security, right? And kind of no segmentation between their, guest network and their live network. There's so many things that were broken about it, that PCI actually did improve. And while it brought the baseline up, which was, there was no baseline. And so to some degree, I think that when we have a look at organizations saying that they want to do the right thing, that they're more likely to do the right thing when there is a huge penalty associated with it. And we see that, for instance, with GDPR in Europe, right? There were a lot of social media companies that said it was impossible to do things like forget somebody. But when GDPR turned up on day one, there was a whole lot of fines went out. We managed to solve problems that we had never solved before because it may be expensive. And so when we have a look at this and we go, businesses making decisions about how much money they want to spend on security is on odds with cyber criminals like DarkSide, who are making millions of money. I mean, the example Dave gave, CNA, what's 40 million in a single payout, huge amounts of money. And if they are able to live in countries where there is no criminal impact whatsoever, you will not go to jail, you can live your life out with your 40 million perfectly safely. It's the Wild West, isn't it? And every company in the US is like a fort, reinventing its own security, responsible for defending itself against a multi-million-dollar industry, right? Billion-dollar industry that's coming after you. And so I do think we need a little more help, because a nation state attack against a small organization, it's difficult not to be collateral damage. So,
No, I completely agree with you. And I do think, to your point around accountability and pain, I've publicly advocated for a while now a couple different things that I think we should do from a public policy perspective to address this. On the one hand, I think there should be what I'll call the equivalent of a Sarbanes-Oxley for cybersecurity, where the board, the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, the CIO, the CISO, whether it's on the creation of technology or on the management of internal systems, has to attest to their state of internal controls, that they have put in place enough controls to mitigate a material or significant event. that would create a lot of accountability there. The other thing is it would create a level of integrity where the CISO or the CIO could have a whistleblower saying, hey, this is inappropriate, kind of like playing with the books financially, right? And then on the other hand, I think what we could and should do is really, again, look at even the security industry and have more transparency on what controls have failed, which do not work. And if every time there was a major breach, we did the equivalent of a National Transportation Safety Board type understanding, we would tease out that complexity and say, again, you can't eliminate risk. So even seatbelts or brakes will not eliminate a car crash. They might eliminate damage and stuff like that. But at least if you understood the efficacy of the controls, the buyers of security technology would know which ones are the equivalent of braking systems for a Model T Ford versus anti-lock braking systems in a race car. You know, and we'd be able to make better economic choices and drive better economic incentives for the security industry, as well as the people creating and managing technology, because it's an economics problem and nobody's really, you know, feeling that accountability in a way that will drive a change in behavior.
Yeah. Are you seeing companies think about this a little bit differently with these large payouts now? I mean, I think before some of these happen, it's probably easier to say, hey, you know, it's going to cost me this many dollars. The probability of having this exposure is fairly remote. So I'm going to kind of do some lip service to this so I feel good about it and I can tell a good story to the board. But is that changing with these large payouts? No,
I don't think in pockets it is. I spend a lot of time with peers. In pockets it is, and there's a lot of people that are doing better. But I'll give you an example without disclosing the organizations. 2 discussions I've had literally in the past 3 weeks. 2 different organizations. One, the financial services, one servicing the public sector. On the financial services stuff, in a discussion around risk, that individual said their #1 enterprise business risk was fraud. In many ways makes sense, financial institutions, stuff like that. I asked about how they would mitigate a potential targeted attack that would bring down their entire trading platform, an extinction level event. You can no longer trade stocks. Your users can't get in. And they were like, well, yeah, but that's, you know, they basically would like, no, the enterprise risk from the top down is fraud. Yet they potentially have an exploitable path and vulnerabilities that would halt all trading for millions of people using their platform. And they don't see it as a critical enterprise risk. That to me is a problem. On the public institution, again, despite all the things going on, the chief information security officer in a debate around decision-making and actions and stuff like that basically said they can't do anything without approval from the general counsel. They can't take an action to mitigate a risk. They can't communicate anything. They can't patch a system. Bad things could be occurring and they can't do anything until the general counsel says yes. So they have to go ask Mother May I. And I said, okay, so let's imagine something really bad happens and a class action lawsuit gets filed. You have 2 choices. You're either perjuring yourself or you're throwing the company and the general counsel under the bus because they handcuffed you in your ability to manage and mitigate risk. Which are you going to do? And they couldn't answer.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what I'm seeing is there are some organizations that are not seeing some of the risks that might be out there. And I think we're notoriously bad at assessing risk, aren't we? Even though Apple called pandemic out as a risk in their end of year financial report, even though the Smithsonian had exhibits around pandemics before this one broke out, along with the fact we were expecting one. When one actually happened, we all sat around and went, this is really unusual and it's really odd. and it shouldn't happen, even though it was kind of predicted. And I think for many organizations, there is the hope that, you know, even as they read these stories, that they won't be the next victim, that somehow they will escape this risk, even though we see it increasing. However, I definitely do see on a C-level, a board level, a growing awareness. And we see, for instance, for many organizations with incident response, they're making sure that they have an incident response plan, that they're going through ransomware run books, that they have steps that they have actually conceived. You're seeing an increase in sales and things like vaults. So data vaults are a capability to vault your data so ransomware can't get to it. So we're certainly, I'm seeing, Dale, that is an increasing awareness, though, as Malcolm quite rightly points out, you know, we quite often don't address some of the risks that we feel that we can't conceive of happening. For instance, a whole trading system going down, though, that we really need to plan for, because, you know, if there's a potential there, sometimes it's the fact that we're not very good at assessing risk versus,
No different than most people weren't prepared for a pandemic, yet it
Yes.
was likely and probable that it would have occurred. You know, there was a question in the chat on who's best to play the role of determining what is an appropriate level of protection as the governing body. I don't think there's a full person. We all misperceive risk. We all have our biases. I think of, again, like the board has a governance role, right, in organizations. And so I think it becomes a multifaceted. What is the chief information security officer? What is the CIO? What are the executives? They have to wrestle through it. That's why I like that idea of a cybersecurity Sarbanes-Oxley. I'm attesting to my state of internal controls. That would force a real governing body, a real governance approach, rather than a lot of boards put their head in the sand and go, oh boy, this is really too technical, or the security person's doing too much geek speak on them. I think the only way to mitigate that and create a forcing function is to really have that level of attestation on a routine basis, as well as transparency around the state of the state. Just like I believe there should be transparency for any organization that pays a ransomware, they should publicly disclose that they did it and why they did it. Why? Because there's a lot, literally, my guess is we're only seeing 20% of the ransomware payments and 80% is being swept under the rug. Why? Because people don't want to state that they have the problem.
I wonder as well, you know, from a government perspective, for me, I would love to see CISA further reinforced. At the moment, CISA acts really as a best advice kind of capability, but I'd like to see them grow teeth. And also at the moment, you know, they report to the Department of Homeland Security, and DHS is a large portfolio. So I'd love to see them having a direct line, right? Cybersecurity is often called the fifth domain, right? In the wake of the NotPetya attack, they actually said that's the closest we've ever come to cyber war. That's what our White House said. With something as critical as cybersecurity and the impact of, you know, the fact that we live in this connected world, it's absolutely critical that we actually move this into a priority, not only in our businesses, but in our government as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently is with all the supply chain disruptions, and I think Malcolm hit on, you know, the interconnected nature within a company between systems, but you know, I mean, is anybody even thinking about the vulnerability of supply chains, their vendors? I mean, I can't make my products if your factory shut down on the parts that you deliver to me, and you know, if you're a critical vendor of mine, I certainly want to make sure that you have controls, that you're not going to be taken over. I mean, if you're a supplier of you know, defense or other kinds of critical infrastructure, you know, have we really? I mean, it doesn't occur to me like we've really thought about all the downstream impacts that some of this might have.
Well, on the one hand, you could argue we have. There's all this third-party risk stuff that has grown in many ways, and you know, and it's managed mitigated risk, but a bunch of it's a bunch of check the box stuff that really hasn't moved the needle. The executive order that came out of the White House around supply chain security, again, after SolarWinds and one of the other attacks, I spent time with the NIST team working on that just a couple of weeks ago. And I think there's a few different things that we need to think about from a supply chain risk perspective when it comes to technology. There's the components itself, the hardware, the software, and again, some level of attestation and accountability for that. But then it's again daisy chained together. I buy this processor, I put this component, I buy this BIOS from somebody else, I get this firmware here, it moves all the way through. So each person along that path needs some level of accountability. But at the same time, beyond just the software and hardware related supply chain, there is a data supply chain. And I'll give you an example of one that I've been worried about for years. And you mentioned the meat packing company from the ransomware. But imagine I'm in the food and beverage organization. Let's just look at I'm a grocery store. How do I know my food is safe? I only know the food is safe from the flow of information from the slaughterhouse to the point of sale. And if there's some animal rights whack job activist out there who wanted to save 10,000 cows tomorrow, and they could manipulate the data, even starting from the slaughterhouse, or play with the industrial control systems on the refrigeration unit on the truck and warm it up and stuff like that. You could literally have a food poisoning issue and people could die if I could play with the integrity of the food safety data. And a lot of people aren't looking at the data flow as a supply chain issue, and they should be.
Yeah, I think that there's so much around, how do we define trust? Because when I do business with somebody and I'm allowing them to impact the output of whatever it is I'm producing, then so much of this comes down to actually being able to define and measure trust. And when we, I think there are businesses out there now saying, well, I'll evaluate vendors and they'll pay me money and I'll have this registry and, they're the middleman. And the only issue with that is, right, if you don't pay them the money, then suddenly you're not a secure company. So we need to make sure that this is actually not some kind of vendor run affair, but this is really, I think, as Malcolm pointed out, something like equivalent of a SOC 2 thing, where you actually have an independent government body that is coming in and actually ensuring that if you claim that you are secure enough, that you're actually secure enough. And there are dangers of tick box compliance. There is no doubt about that. But we're moving to a world of continuous compliance. There was a point when we had to kind of gather manual dashboards around risk and compliance, right? But as we move to a more code-enabled world, right, as we move towards the cloud, one of the benefits of that is being able actually to have a much better capability at being able to understand when we have things like security posture drift. Security posture drift, that's really the issue, right? Is I got it all right, I policy audit, and then things move around.
Yeah, no, exactly, which is why you need to continually understand those attack paths and all that stuff. And, again, you mentioned an interesting thing on trust. For me, trust is a very simple definition. Trust is a function of competence and character. Competencies are the evidence, the outcomes, the proof that you're doing a good enough job. Character is what's your intent and your integrity. And if there's a profit motive to deflect it, you got to question perhaps the integrity side of what somebody might do, but you got to look for the evidence and the competencies. And I look at it very simply from that perspective. And the dialogues I've had with vendors, the dialogues I hope my customers have with me, is they ask me, knowing that you can't eliminate risk, let's look at it like a physical perspective. Earthquakes, you build to a certain earthquake code. I have a safe, I have a fire rating on it. Okay, well, if you look at it, and I'll go back to some of the roles that I've had, my goal was to only have a nation state actor be able to get in, and they had to work for it, because you can't eliminate risk. Now, when people know that that's my design goal, and I can explain to them how I'm achieving that, knowing that we can't eliminate risk, they have a higher level of trust, despite what might be in the check the box third-party risk stuff. because I like to have relationships with people. And that's how I garner trust, by knowing my peers in organizations that are critical to me. That's how I create trust with my customers. I have personal relationships with my peers so that they know my philosophical views. They know my ethical and social responsibility stances on it. They know I'm not going to just go along to get along, and I'm never going to give up. I'm always going to stay in the fight. To me, doing that is a better way to establish trust and maintain it than the way in which we're doing it with just pushing paper back and forth.
I guess the difficulty, though, is that essentially, having some measurement about trust, it takes away some of the subjectivity around it. And so I love the way that Cloud Security Alliance actually did some work in defining trust and using artifacts like audit reports, service level agreements, published uptimes, but they also do say public impression, right? Financials as well. All of these kind of impact, and certainly for each organization to have how they, measure trust of a vendor will help you take a more objective approach to actually establishing which vendors you want to do business with.
Completely agree. I've had vendors who've had breaches, and they've called me up before it went public and said, we had this occur. We're investigating it. You might be impacted. Guess what? Their trust factor went way up. Why? Because they proved they understood my desires for information, took action to help me manage and mitigate the risk, and were there to help, in essence, have my back. So did I trust them more despite the incident? Yeah. Why? Because of how they managed it, how they communicated, and how they dealt with it.
And one thing that you mentioned earlier was about the ransomware payments and perhaps an estimation that only 20% of those are ever really made public. What are some of the interesting ethical conversations around and considerations around making ransomware payments? And perhaps that's a segue or maybe a precursor question to that would be, who are some of these groups? And I think Sushila mentioned a couple of them, but who are some of these groups that are receiving payments? Where is this money going? And then what are the ethical considerations on actually making a ransomware payment when you are attacked?
Yeah, for me, let's just look at it from the ethical perspective first. I've always had a belief that if I'm paying somebody a ransom, I'm paying somebody who will likely physically harm others. The organized crime, they do human trafficking, prostitution rings, drug rings. If it's a nation state, it could be a terrorist. Heck, there was evidence that the Mumbai bombings back in 2007, $2 million of the funding to go do that terrorist activity came from cybercrime. So if you start with the basis that people might die or their human rights might be violated if you pay somebody, then the calculus of should you pay changes. And then you can proportionally go, well, who's going to be impacted because I wasn't doing a good job on my internal information security? If it's just a revenue loss, well, guess what? I think you should belly up to the bar, own it, not pay. But again, if you're a hospital or something where somebody might die or it's critical infrastructure and has a bunch of cascading effects that could have societal harm, the calculus of pay or not pay changes. So for me, I think there should be a set of principles to establish an organization that are, in essence, predefine those ethical choices and who's the decision maker and some direction of the proportionality of impact that would need to occur before you paid. But that's also why I like a transparency requirement that if somebody paid, the public at least understands it, and the court of public opinion can decide if they made the right social choice for their customers and stakeholders.
I think it might be worth as well considering, Dale, that the US Treasuries has come out and published a sanction list of people that you are not supposed to pay ransomware to. So when you're coming up with your policy, and it's difficult to say hey, never pay the ransomware. As Malcolm said, it's generally a bad idea to do that, because very often what they've done is they've stolen your data. There's a chance that they won't give you the decryption key, that it encourages additional actions. However, we do understand that under some circumstances, for whatever reason, people feel that their back is against the wall and they need to pay. So for step one is make sure they're not on the sanction list, right? Because otherwise, the
But how do you do that with I mean, you can't trust the fact that they're not on a sanction list. So that's where I go. Those sanction lists have already OFAC and stuff for years, and I would bet my job and my career that many people have paid people on that sanction list. They just didn't know. Right. So there's no way to really validate that.
So as a general sanction list, the second thing I would suggest is you actually work with a third party that's had experience around negotiating ransomware. People often ask, do I negotiate, right? Don't I just pay? Is it a yes/no binary? I would suggest that you actually get the authorities involved first of all, right? The FBI, that actually will be able to help you identify as well if these people are on the sanction list. The danger, of course, when you get the authorities involved, you do lose control over the situation. They are now in control. To get some money that was paid to DocSide by actually getting the Bitcoin currency in their wallet. So, I would advocate to have a ransomware run book, identify under what conditions you may pay the ransom. And hopefully those are non-existent, but if they do exist, that you've identified them. And then you identify how you're going to do it. Because if you pay, anonymous currency is just not 100% anonymous, right? So the way that you pay it, if every bad guy out there knows that you paid, right, they're coming after you. So make very sure that if you're paying them, that you're working with the authorities, and also you're truly paying in an anonymous fashion. And the best way of doing that is working with a company that actually negotiates ransomware payouts. Many, many companies also believe that their cybersecurity insurance policies covers things like ransomware payouts and all of the rest. Be very careful that in fact your cybersecurity insurance is doing what you think it will do, that it will pay out everything that you think it will, and then be very aware again that however they got in, that's the way they'll get in again. So once they're in your network, they would have left back doors for themselves, right, to be able to get back in. And model currently tends to be steal all your data, right? So I'm going to publish it if you don't do what I say it to do, right? And that, in fact, happened with a very large provider not so long ago. They went, yeah, okay, go ahead and publish it.
Yep. Well, and I think there's a twist on ransomware that I know has occurred in some cases, and I think it warrants mentioning it, because people just think of being locked out of their data or the typical data dump of personal information or intellectual property. There's a ransomware that's more of a blackmail-oriented ransomware. Imagine getting access to your HR legal database on all the harassment, hostile work environment, who slept with who, the payouts that were made, and that being ransomed. Otherwise, you dump it. Think of the brand damage that would create and the implications for your executive officers. Think of the home systems of your executives and the cyber risk of those systems, the cameras, the mics, what their kids are doing, what their spouse is doing, what their partners are doing, who's sleeping with who, that is in those systems. And imagine, those home systems getting popped and the executive being, in essence, blackmailed. Do you have policies around that? Do you have the equivalent of cybersecurity executive protection, like you would for physical protection? There's a bunch of different angles to ransomware that are not prevalent in the news, that are also substantial risk issues to a brand or an organization that are, again, not necessarily being considered, and in many cases not being managed well.
Yeah, in fact, the police department was subject to a ransomware attack where they stole their information. So some pretty
Yeah.
confidential stuff going on there. So certainly, I think you have to be very aware that if somebody's holding you to ransom, right, and they've stolen your data, even if you pay the ransom, what's to stop them from exposing you? Will they then hit you a second time, right? And even then a third, because once they have your data, you really believe that they said, oh yeah, we totally deleted it, right?
No, you're totally right, which is also why from when you look at it, we also have to start migrating to some level beyond just data vaults. I'd say self-protecting data capabilities that inherently the data itself can have some recognition of where it is it, and really kind of having that built into data elements itself. And there are some emerging capabilities that are out there that are starting to do that.
Yep, no, attribute-based encryption is really interesting, where we can use attributes like person's identity, geography, and all the rest to actually build it into the access level. Totally agree with you. Definitely worth checking, of course, that, even if you have your data encrypted, if you've been subject to a breach, of course, now quantum computing is becoming real. There's a real move to go back and, how much data that was stolen that was encrypted, will we be able to unencrypt now? So, yeah, definitely worth bearing in mind. But I think, for me, Gail, I think the important thing for folks to do is to make sure that they have a ransomware preparedness run book, that they're working with a professional that every year, right, sees incidents and are able to take them through the paces of, hey, what did this happen to you, right? That they're doing pen testing. DocSide, as I mentioned, they're always got jobs ads out for pen testers. That's what the bad guys are doing. So if they're doing that against you, you better get in ahead of that, right? Run pen testing to be able to understand what your vulnerabilities are. Make sure you've got your breaks in place, right? So your multi-factor authentication and that kind of thing. That's just
They're table stakes.
They're table stakes, right?
That if you don't have,
without your break, yeah.
If you don't have that, there's a level of negligence.
Yeah,
frankly.
You just have to do it, and especially in this day and age, it's absolutely critical. And then working, should the worst happen, make sure that company that you've been rehearsing and going through this with is there to help you, and then also work with the authorities on this, because these are huge crimes. I mean, 40 million from CNA, that's massive. They're difficult to combat. Full compassion to the people that get attacked. It's really hard to make sure every door that you have in the place is locked, right? And I think, Malcolm's point about it's so important, yes, that you may be a victim of a blast, that you minimize that blast radius as well. So if they get in, they don't get to the next point and the next point, right? We need to get better about east-west traffic movement.
And beyond just detecting it, which we need to do, but understanding it, which the only way to do that is to understand, the exploitable attack paths in your environment.
Yep. And I think we also got some questions here.
Yeah. You want me to read those?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with regards to third parties, how do you ensure your contract with the third party adequately covers cyber risk? Are there best practices? Do you need to hire a security expert within your procurement area?
I think certainly procurement plays a role, but the question becomes, how is your security team plugged into the procurement process? When I was back at Intel, I did that in 2004. So well before all this stuff, but I was also a former finance and procurement guy and could see where it was coming. So I put stuff literally in the purchasing processes, even the credit card, small purchase order credit card processes, to understand system and data elements so that we could flag for things that might create cyber risk. I was doing that 17 years ago. I think if you have a security team, you just got to build that into the purchasing process. Heck, even if you're hiring an insurance company, hiring a law firm, why? They have sensitive data of yours, right? There's emails going back and forth. So even in the things that are not a technology purchase, like buying a laptop, you have to think about the cyber component if they're accessing or there's any exchange of data or information or systems connectivity.
Yep, Target, it was an HVAC company. We had JPMC, right? It was a foundation group that got hacked. So yeah, completely agree. So what we did is we got cybersecurity to work with procurement to ensure that the assessment process put up red flags where we saw risk and would get the cybersecurity team involved if those to help procurement resolve those red flags if they needed it to resolve. So I think it is really important, you know, adding people into your supply chain is a bigger decision today than maybe it was yesterday. And you need that not only financial risk assessment, you need a cybersecurity risk assessment.
Well, and I'll widen it beyond just cybersecurity and think of privacy as a part of that as
Yes,
well.
so
And other
true.
items. You know, again, in my Intel days, Intel would do things on site sometimes for kids.
Mm.
Well, you've got children online privacy stuff. Because of the stuff that I built for cybersecurity, and we had some privacy hooks. When those things were occurring, even for events, we triggered a whole children's privacy related stuff because in some cases there was cameras, there was recording. We needed to make sure we had permissions correctly. So I would say beyond just the cyber stuff, make sure you think about the totality of what I'll call the information risks. Because you might have some other things that could be covered by the same business process.
That's a really great point, especially with SaaS vendors, because SaaS vendors occasionally are saying, hey, you know, you store your data in our SaaS, we're going to use it for our, you know, data, other revenue business. So be really careful from a contractual perspective. I think Malcolm's really right. If, you know, data is the new oil, we've kind of sprung a leak. So make sure that your contracts also cover the integrity and the confidentiality of the data, especially with SaaS providers.
Okay, thanks. So one more here. What does the talent pipeline look like for filling the growing number of needs in the cybersecurity field? Yesterday, Microsoft announced a partnership with a number of community colleges to help provide scholarships to educate 25,000 students in the field, which implies that large shortages of this talent exist.
Well, I mean, we've seen for what, a decade now, 1 million shortage, 2 million, 3 million, you know, so the number's large. I do think we have to go deeper, and I applaud Microsoft's effort to go to community colleges. I advocate, you know, it's like a trade craft, right? You know, we've got to go into the almost the equivalent of the trade schools and get people at different levels with different backgrounds to do this stuff. At the same time, we've got to go beyond just doing it in the reactive sense that we've been doing it today. We've got to go, and I would advocate for some of the stuff that we need to do is in a company that creates technology. Literally, you can get promoted by creating technology with vulnerabilities. You can become a principal engineer. You could run an engineering organization and ship vulnerabilities all day long. Why? Because you created functionality that created a profit. What we also have to start doing is making sure that the developers of technology have a systems level view and understand secure coding, understand secure architecture, understand a security development lifecycle. And they should also never move up the promotion chain until they develop and demonstrate competencies to do it securely from the beginning. Because if we don't do that, we continue to perpetuate vulnerable technology at the creation stage.
I also think, and this is kind of a new move in the industry, is that we need to take a product portfolio approach to the building of services. And this is actually, I just recently read a chapter in a book around this. How do you reinvent workforce? Because you're absolutely right, Dale. There's such a shortage of technical people at a time when we most need them, right? And it kind of also coincides with the Great Resignation crisis. And so there's certainly a shortage of skills, especially because we're reinventing the way that we do things. And so this idea of taking a product portfolio approach is for CISOs to actually have a look at the services that they need to be able to secure the business. And when you look at those services, you make a determination, are you going to deliver those services yourself, or are you simply going to outsource those services, right? And for this, the prime function that most CISOs, I think, are looking for is to have the capability, the cybersecurity capability to provide governance. So when you do outsource those services, services, that you're actually getting the right results from those capabilities, and essentially building up that matrix of, what do I need to do myself? What may be more cost effective to do it a different way? And then further reinforcing that with internally for your folks, right? Having, as Malcolm said, everybody should know something about cybersecurity, just like everybody should recognize road signs, right? And so building that learning culture, and it's everybody's responsibility to not click on that phishing link, right? It's everybody's responsibility not to share their password. So we all need to create this culture of pride around our cybersecurity capabilities, right? And also make it easily able for folks to be able to move into this arena. And very often when we look at, ISACA does a really brilliant workforce report every year. And, they came out and talked about most managers saying that it's actually soft skills that their people are missing, that you can train somebody in, let's say, Azure cloud security, but it's really difficult to train somebody in negotiation skills. And so to some degree, I think we've been really strict about our hiring, going, I want somebody that has, Securonix experience, 5 years, this, that, and the other. And maybe we need to accept that we're looking for people with the right soft skills, with technical interests, the capability to learn, and then go ahead and train them. And for those of you that are interested in going into cybersecurity, I really recommend that you get involved in community organizations, right? Really get involved with folks like Cloud Security Alliance, ISC Squared, ISACA, so many opportunities for you to get experience through volunteering, as well as learning and contributing back to the community. So that's certainly my suggestions out there, is that you will need less general skills if you take a more targeted, these are the services I need to be able to secure my business, and then clearly align your workforce with those services that you need to secure your business. And then support that learning environment by encouraging your folks to, do exams and attend community organizations and that kind of thing.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this hour that we had. I want to again thank you, Sushila and Malcolm, for a wonderful discussion and really insightful and fascinating stuff. And certainly a topic that we could probably spend hours more talking about, some of these different attacks and different ways and things that we should be thinking about in our companies. But certainly I appreciate your thoughts, and I think there was a number of good takeaways and things for all of us here in the forum, both students that might be considering potential career opportunities, as well as practitioners to take back to our own companies to think about ways we can better manage and mitigate some of the growing cybersecurity risks that are out there. So again, I want to thank you on behalf of Drake and the Drake University Risk and Opportunity Forum.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Dale. Thanks for inviting us to speak.
Thank you, Dale, Sushila, Malcolm. Very much appreciate your insights shared this morning and your support of the Drake Risk and Opportunity Forum. We will take a brief break. We'll be back at 30 minutes past the hour, 11:30 Central Time, and we will be joined by Chunka Moy, a futurist, innovation advisor, and author, who will speak about a brief history of a perfect future. Stick around, grab a break, and come right back. Thank you.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Chunka. Looking forward to it in a few minutes.
Thanks. I am as well.